Welcome to week 3 in our Philippians study. It's Curtis. I'm glad to have you along for the ride. Our passage of scripture for today is found in Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 to 18, as you see beside me. We'll get to that in a moment, but first I want to take you somewhere else. I want to take you to 17th century England, and specifically to the events that are taking place around the Church of England. There's a powerful and popular preacher who is found himself at odds with the church leaders of that time. They're threatened by the crowds he's drawing. They're concerned that his message of grace is so different than their own, and so they decide to silence him by throwing him in prison. And the guy I'm talking about is John Bunyan. He was no stranger to imprisonments, actually spent quite a bit of his life in prison, away from his wife and his kids, the rest of his loved ones. Actually, on one of those occasions, they told him that they'd release him conditional to one thing. He stopped preaching. And he famously replied, if you release me today, I'll be preaching tomorrow. And so that's what he did. He would not be silent about the grace of Jesus Christ. And even as an inmate, he preached to the rest of the prisoners at the Bedford jail. In fact, there's stories told of hundreds of people outside of the prison that would come against the walls of that prison just for the opportunity to hear him preaching over those prison walls. And so eventually the authorities did what you might think. They decided to hide him further into the recesses of that prison where no one else could access him and his voice couldn't ring out, or at least that's what they thought. And the cool thing that God did was in that place of solitude, he allowed John Bunyan to write a Christian classic, one of my favorite books. It's called The Pilgrim's Progress. And that's the background for it. Written in a time where, by any other measure, he had been silenced, he had lost, he had been defeated, and yet out of it, God brought all sorts of ministry opportunity, and his voice rang louder than it ever did in his freedom. And so even in these last centuries, just after the Bible, coming in at number 2, Pilgrim's Progress is the most read and translated book in the English language. So pretty cool story, and it's a good picture of how God redeems. It's a good picture of how our world might intend evil, and yet God is constantly using it for good. And that's really the story of church history. It's the story of the Bible. Maybe you think of Joseph. His brothers had treated him so cruelly in the book of Genesis, and eventually years pass, and here they are standing across from them, and these are the words that Joseph says. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. God just keeps on saving lives. God keeps on redeeming. What is intended as evil, he keeps on turning into good. No better example of that than what we just celebrated this past Easter weekend, of course, with the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so back to Philippians. We're going to experience more of this redeeming of God. Paul is in Rome. He's writing to the Christians in Philippi. He's been under house arrest for 2 years, spending every moment of that time chained to a Roman soldier. God was still at work. In fact, he was so much at work that Paul had become the talk of the town. It seems the city of Rome and even abroad are abuzz with the way that Paul's handling his circumstances. Now let's think about the letter to the Philippians, verses 12 to 18. Let's say you're a part of that congregation and you haven't seen Paul, haven't heard from Paul in a while. You're likely wondering one thing. How is he doing? How is Paul doing under all of these heavy circumstances? And the letter begins to be read, and I think these verses kind of are Paul's response to that question. How's it going, Paul? And interestingly, he doesn't talk about his personal health or how cold it is at night. He doesn't complain about how long his trial is taking to sort out. None of those things are offered by Paul. Instead, what he wants to talk about is the thing that matters most to him. And that's Jesus. That's Jesus changing lives. Jesus being present with Paul even in the midst of those chains. And so what I want to do is, in the rest of the video, is just throw 3 questions at you. 3 questions I've been thinking about, and I want to invite you to think about this week in response to verses 12 to 18, and especially the first half of those verses. So question 1. Is my joy rooted in external circumstances or in knowing and serving Jesus? Right? We're going to face circumstances we don't want to walk through. That's just a fact of life. The Bible nowhere denies that. Yet we find Paul saying that his joy is increasing. He says he's rejoiced and he's going to continue to do so. And maybe we'd say, how's that possible? Why can you say that, Paul? And the reason is he doesn't link his joy to personal health or chains or imprisonment or all of these things. It's why, nothing could steal his joy, whether it's a Roman emperor, soldiers, floggings, beatings, shipwrecks, snake bites, prison cells, lies, slander, attacks from angry mobs, personal failure, physical pain, even the threat of execution. None of it stole his joy because his joy couldn't be stolen. It was rooted in Jesus. It was not rooted in circumstances, but in a desire to see the work of Jesus continue. Like we looked at last week, that he who began the good work would see it through completion. And Paul just wanted to see that keep moving forward. So I asked you about your circumstances. Where's your joy rooted? In your health or your job or your finances or your personal security, your relationships with other people? Problem is, as soon as those start to go a bit awry, we start to question God, we lose our joy, and soon joy gives way to anger and doubt or fear or complaining. How about self-pity and ingratitude? It's a struggle we all face, and so I'm asking you this week, do a little diagnosis. Is your joy rooted in circumstances, having everything the way you want it to be, or in simply knowing Jesus, regardless of what comes your way? Second question, as we think about Paul being chained day and night to a soldier for 2 years. How can the good news of Jesus be advanced through me right now? So again, like I said last week, we're all kind of under our much less serious house arrest for an indefinite period of time. And it's a circumstance we haven't chosen. It's something we don't really want. We're growing tired of it. Our kids are too. But how can the gospel advance through us even as we go through this situation? And the picture Paul's using is that of an army, advanced army team who has to go through the dense trees and underbush and just kind of hack a path for others to follow. Or a pioneer or an explorer going to places no one's ever been to chart the course so others can follow. How are your circumstances being used to push forward and advance the gospel of Jesus Christ? Because that's what God's interested in doing. I read this quote. It stuck with me. I'm going to show it to you. If you look at the highlighted part, it says, Paul therefore saw the events, so his chains, as forging new territory for the gospel. They took Paul into contact with a select group of people, soldiers and Roman officials who otherwise would have had no relationship to him. They also prompted a renewed evangelistic effort in the city. While others may have seen the end of missionary activity, right, because Paul's in chains, Paul saw the new ways the gospel could advance. The events which seemed to inhibit the freedom of the gospel became its springboard. Paul did not say in spite of these events, but rather through them. Right? It wasn't just that God was working in spite of his chains, it's that through those chains, the gospel was being advanced. And you think about it this way, at the other end of that chain, every day and every night for 2 years was a rotation of Roman soldiers who paraded him through all those upper parts of Roman society that he otherwise would have had no part in. And so from God's perspective, we could ask, who really was chained to who? All of those soldiers were captive to Paul's evangelizing, to his prayer life, to his love of the church. his teaching on Jesus Christ. And no wonder we read that so many Roman soldiers became Christians. And even members of Caesar's household became Christians. The gospel was advancing, not in spite of the chains of Paul, but through the chains of Paul. He had become the talk of the town because of how he was handling his trial. And so back to your circumstances, back to my circumstances. What are we facing? And is our ultimate purpose that God be honored and the gospel go forward? Or is our focus simply on changing and controlling everything so it's all how we want it and ending up missing the opportunity that's sitting right in front of us? Maybe another way to ask it, it's what's the talk of the town when it comes to how we're dealing with our chains? And here's the last question I have for you. How can I live this season so that other believers are encouraged by my example? Okay, so question 2 is more about non-Christians. This one's more about Christians. Verse 14 says that not only were the Roman soldiers hearing about Jesus, but the Christians in Rome and elsewhere, for example, Philippi, they were emboldened, they were encouraged by the way Paul was living so faithfully in such difficult times. And that happens still today, right? Think of how many times your faith has been strengthened, your hope's been renewed, your spirit's been convicted because you've seen someone who has every reason to quit just powering through by the grace of God. And you feel like you can stand a little straighter and, pray a little deeper and make it through your own struggles. And so I guess that's the last question I have for you. How is your life being lived so that it can be an encouragement to others in their own faith and in their own trials? So there's 3 questions. I guess they're not too fancy, but they're the ones I'm thinking of, and I leave them with you to wrestle with a little bit before Wednesday. I hope that you're going to join me for this week's Zoom session. It's April 15th, 7 o'clock again. That's a Wednesday night, not Thursday this week. We'll keep it Wednesday going forward. All the meeting ID and passwords on the screen if you want to pause and scribble that down. Otherwise, right below this video where all the info's written in the description, you can find a link in the same info here. I'm going to close with a favorite quote that I've been holding out. This is one of my favorite things I read in my study from J.A. Mochier. He says, as Paul looks forward into the future, he expresses what is in fact his abiding attitude. Now, as always, Christ will be honored. How that word now needs to eat its way into our hearts and minds and wills. It is now that we must show how great Christ is. Here, listen in, lean in here. Never again will we have the chance to live for him through this moment, to please him in this circumstance, to gladden him by trusting in this ordeal. Did you catch that? You only get to live this moment once. And so my prayer is that God would allow each of us by his strength, the power of his Holy Spirit, to live this moment well for his name's sake, for the sake of a world that still needs to know him, and for the encouragement of fellow Christians in our lives. So have a great week. Look forward to seeing you Wednesday. God bless.